Chapter 5. The Rock Tower. That night we made our camp at the base of the cliffs. The high tower of rock was near us, and on top of it was one high tree. "The pterodactyl that I shot was on that tree," said Professor Challenger. Professor Summerlee, for the first time, seemed to believe Professor Challenger. "But," continued Professor Challenger, "we still have a big problem. How can we get to the plateau? There must be a way up because Maple White arrived there. During my last expedition, I explored to the east." "Well," said Lord John, "we should explore to the west." The next day we walked west, and we arrived at Maple White's old camp. There we found an indication left by Maple White. It pointed west. Soon we came to an area of bamboo under the cliffs. In the middle of this, I saw something white. We cut away some of the bamboo and discovered a skull and then a skeleton. The skeleton had clothes and boots. It was obviously a European. "Who is this?" asked Lord John. "Every bone in his body is broken." "I know who he is," said Professor Challenger. "It's James Clover, Maple White's friend. Maple White didn't come here alone. It's also clear," said Lord John, "that he fell from the top of the cliffs or somebody pushed him." We were all silent. Did someone throw him? We began to think of the possible dangers in that unknown land above us. We continued walking until we saw an arrow marked on the rocks of the cliffs. "Maple White again," said Professor Challenger. We continued for another 5 miles and came to an opening in the cliffs. There was another arrow pointing higher up. We followed this arrow and came to a cave. There was another arrow there. Lord John had an electric torch, and we entered the cave. But the cave was blocked by large rocks. This was the way Maple White arrived at the top, but now we could not use it. The next day we walked 22 miles around the base of the cliffs and made camp again. Lord John shot a large animal called an agouti for our dinner. We gave half to the Indians, and we cooked half of it over a fire. That night there was no moon, and it was very dark. Then something incredible happened. Suddenly, we heard the sound of gigantic wings from above. Then, for a second, in the light of the fire, we saw a long neck, 2 red eyes, and a beak with teeth. Then this creature flew away with our dinner. It was a pterodactyl. We were all shocked, and Summerlee was the first to speak. "Professor Challenger," he said very seriously, "I must apologize. I was wrong." The next day we continued to walk around the cliffs. However, we didn't find a way up to the top. Then, after 5 days, we arrived at our first camp again. When we went to bed, we were very depressed. The next morning, Professor Challenger was very happy. "I have found a way to the top," he said. "How?" I asked. Professor Challenger pointed to the top of the tower. "Yes," I said, "we can get to the top of that tower, but there is a gap between the tower and the plateau." "When we are on the top, I will show you," said Professor Challenger. With the help of ropes, we climbed to the top. Professor Challenger looked at the tall tree on the top and said, "This tree will save us." "A bridge!" cried Lord John. "Exactly, my friends, a bridge," said Challenger. "And now our strong young friend will cut down the tree." He then gave me an axe. I began to cut down the tree. It finally fell down and made a bridge for us. The 4 of us then crossed. We were in the wonderful new world. It was a moment of victory. We walked forward a little bit, and then we heard a loud noise. We returned to the edge of the cliff. Our bridge was gone. Then we saw Gomez on the other side. "I pushed the tree down," he shouted. "You can never get down now. You'll die up there. I am Lopez's brother, the man Lord John shot 5 years ago. Now I can die happy." Gomez began to go down the tower, but Lord John shot him. We were certainly trapped. We called Zambo, and with the ropes, we pulled up some food. The next morning, we made our camp. Then we began our exploration of the plateau, which we called Maple White Land. Lord John walked in front. After we walked for a couple of minutes, he stopped. "Look at this," he said. "These are the tracks of the biggest bird in the world." "Not a bird," said Professor Challenger. "What then?" asked Lord John. "A dinosaur," Professor Challenger answered. We continued walking and came to an opening in the forest. There in front of us were 5 of the most incredible creatures in the world. 2 adults and 3 young ones. They had skin like a reptile. They looked like gigantic kangaroos. Lord John held his gun. The 2 professors were excited and happy. Unconsciously, they held each other's hand and watched like 2 young children. "What will they say in England about this?" Professor Summerlee asked. "I know exactly what they will say," Professor Challenger replied. "They'll say that we are frauds." "And if we take photographs?" "They'll say that they are fakes," said Challenger. "And if we bring back a dinosaur?" said Summerlee. "Well, then perhaps they'll believe us," said Challenger. "Iguanodons," said Summerlee. "You can find their fossil footprints all over the south of England. They lived there millions of years ago, but conditions changed. Here, conditions haven't changed, and these animals have lived." We continued walking. Finally, we came to a very large hole. At the bottom of this hole was a small area of water. Around this water were the pterodactyls' nests. It was a horrible thing to see. Professor Challenger went too close and they saw us. They began to attack us. We were very fortunate to survive. That night, in our camp, Lord John came to talk to me. "Malone," he said, "do you remember the place where those pterodactyls were?" "Very clearly." "It was a kind of volcanic hole." "Yes, exactly." "It had a blue color." "Yes, but why?" "Oh, nothing, nothing," he answered and walked away. Chapter 6, I Was the Hero. The next day we stayed in the camp. We were very tired from our adventures. That night we heard horrible cries from the forest. "What was that?" I said quietly. "We've just heard," replied Challenger, "the sounds of a prehistoric tragedy. Some carnivorous dragon has killed an iguanodon." Then Summerlee raised his hand. "Quiet!" he cried. "I hear something." Some giant creature was coming towards our camp. "I think it's going to jump into our camp," I said, preparing my rifle. "Don't shoot," said Lord John quietly. "If it jumps into our camp, it'll kill us all," said Summerlee. "I have an idea," cried Lord John. Then he did something incredibly courageous. He picked up a burning torch from the fire. Then he went quickly out of the area of our camp. He ran towards the creature. In that moment, we could see it in the light. It was all covered with blood. A moment later, the horrible creature ran away. "I knew it," said Lord John, laughing. "That monster is afraid of fire." The next day, we found pieces of iguanodon on the ground. The 2 professors examined them carefully. "In my opinion," said Professor Challenger, That horrible creature was an Allosaurus. That evening, we returned to the camp and began to discuss our future plans. "Tomorrow," said Professor Summerlee, "we should try to leave this land." "What?" said Professor Challenger. "We must explore it. I am surprised at you, Professor Summerlee." "Professor Challenger," responded Professor Summerlee, "if we are killed, nobody in London will ever know about our discoveries. We can return to London and then prepare a larger expedition. Now we must leave this plateau." "Perhaps you're right," answered Challenger, "but first we must at least make a map of Maple White Land." "That will take too much time," said Summerlee. "There are no high mountains. How can we see all of the plateau?" Then I had an idea. There was a very large tree near us. "I can go up to the top of this tree," I said. "There I can see all of the plateau and make a map." I began to climb the tree. After a minute or two, I saw something incredible, a face. The face of a horrible red ape man was looking at me. It made angry noises at me, but then it disappeared quickly. I was shocked, but I decided to continue to climb. When I arrived at the top, I looked around. In the distance, I saw a lake. Then I drew a map of Maple White Land. When I came down again, I described the ape man to my friends. "Perhaps," said Challenger, "it was a kind of primitive man between ape and man, the missing link. We must discover more about it." "No," said Summerlee, "we must leave this land. Now we have the map. We can try to return to civilization." That night, I was too excited to sleep after my adventure. I thought about Gladys. She wanted me to be a hero. I could go to explore the Central Lake alone. I could go during the night and be back before morning. I left the camp quietly and walked towards the lake. There was a bright moon and I could see well. I arrived at the edge of the lake at 1 o'clock. I climbed up on a large rock and looked around. I could see some cliffs on the other side of the plateau. There were a series of caves in these cliffs. Now I could see lights in them. So there were humans on the plateau. I could see many creatures in the lake. One had a long neck and swam in the water. Then I heard the sound of a large animal walking very near me. I saw it. It was very familiar to me. But why? Then I remembered. It was the creature in Maple White's drawing, a Stegosaurus. When I looked at my watch again, it was 2 o'clock. It was time to return to the camp. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a rifle. I ran towards the camp and shouted. Nobody answered. When I arrived, I saw blood on the ground. All my friends were gone. I was alone in that world. But then I remembered Zambo. I went to the edge of the cliff. Zambo was still there at his camp waiting for us. There was an Indian with him. Zambo climbed up to the top of the tower of rock. When he was opposite me, I threw a letter to him for the Indian to take to the nearest village. Maybe he could bring ropes to help us climb down. Chapter 7. Prisoners of the Apen. I went back to our camp and tried to get some rest. It was horrible to try and sleep here, but it was safer than the jungle. The thought that I could die in this place made me very unhappy. The light from Zambo's fire was the only hope of escape from this dangerous world. The next morning, Sir John woke me up. "Quick, quick, young man," he said. "What? What is it?" I cried. "Don't stop to think or talk. Just get the rifles and some food," he responded. In a moment, we had everything and began running away. Finally, we found a place to hide and stopped to rest. I told him quickly about my adventures the night before. "But what happened to you?" I asked him. "Well," he began, "early yesterday morning hundreds of apes started jumping down from the trees above us. They captured us all and took us to where they live. They tied Summerlee and me up, but strangely enough, Challenger looked a lot like the king of the Apemen. They gave him special treatment. He stayed with the king and ate fruit. You see, this plateau is divided between the Apemen and the Indians. The caves you saw with lights belong to the Indians. There's a constant war between the two groups. In fact, yesterday, the Apemen brought back 12 prisoners. They pulled the arms off of 2 of them and killed them. It was a horrible thing to see. We also discovered that they have a special ceremony. They take their prisoners to the edge of the cliff, and then they throw them off. That is what happened to James Clover, Maple White's friend. Yesterday, they pushed 4 of the Indians off the cliffs. Early this morning, I escaped and went to our camp. There I got you and the guns, and here we are." After we rested and talked, we ran quickly to where the Apemen lived. We arrived and hid behind some trees. I saw something that I will never forget. There was an open area of grass near the edge of the cliffs. The small houses of the Apemen were in the trees, and they were made of leaves. In this area, there were about 100 Apemen. In front of them, there was a little group of Indians and Professor Summerlee. Then I saw 2 other strange individuals. One of them was Professor Challenger, and the other was the king of the Apemen. Both of them were short with big chests and large heads. They were both covered with hair. The big difference between the two was that the professor's hair was black and the king's hair was red. Then the Apemen took one of the Indians and pushed him off the cliffs. They waited for their next victim. This time, it was Summerlee. 2 of the Apemen caught him by the arms. Challenger turned to the king. He tried to convince him not to kill Summerlee. The king pushed Challenger away, and then, in that moment, Lord John shot him. "Shoot them! Shoot, young man! Shoot!" he cried. Professor Challenger and I helped Summerlee to run away. Lord John continued to shoot the Apemen. We ran and ran. Finally, we arrived at our camp. We thought we were safe, but then we heard the sound of feet. Lord John went outside with his rifle and found the surviving Indians. They were very frightened. One of them, we thought, was their chief. We could not stay in the camp. The Apemen knew where it was. We left with the Indians and found another place to hide. That night, before we slept, Professor Challenger came to me. "Mr. Malone," he said very seriously, "you won't write that I looked like the king of the Apemen?" "Professor, I'll only write the truth," I answered. "Very good," said Professor Challenger and went to sleep. The next morning, we decided to go to the Indian caves. We left the forest and walked across an open area. When we arrived at the lake, our Indian friends began to shout with joy. A large number of canoes were coming towards us. When they arrived on land, an older Indian came and embraced the young chief. They had spears and bows and arrows. They were there to save their young chief from the Apemen. Then the young chief began to talk to his men. He told them that now was the time to attack and defeat the Apemen for the last time. They were all together, and they had the help of these strange men with great magic, our rifles. We, too, decided to go with them the next day to fight the Apemen. That evening we made our camp by the lake. We saw many strange creatures in the water with long necks. One of them came out of the water onto the beach. "Plesiosaurus! It's a plesiosaurus!" cried Summerlee. "My dear Challenger, we're the luckiest zoologists that have ever lived." Lord John was not interested in the wonderful animals. Again, he noticed the blue color of the ground near some volcanic holes. The next day, more Indians came. Now there were about 400 or 500 of them. We all went towards the forest to fight our war against the Apen. Before we arrived, the Apen attacked us. In the open, it was easy to defeat them. When we went in the forest, it was more difficult. But with the help of the rifles, in the end, the Indians won. After the battle, Challenger turned to us and said, "We've seen one of the typical great battles of history. What, my friends, is the victory of one nation over another nation? It's not important. The result is always the same. The most important victories of human history were different. They were the victories of primitive man over tigers, of primitive man over ape men. Now the future on this plateau belongs to man." Chapter 8. Back to London. After the victory, the Indians invited us to stay with them in their caves. Lord John did not think this was a good idea. So we made our camp near their caves. We now had time to observe the animals of the lake and the plateau. There were many fascinating things to see, but we wanted to go back home. The Indians never helped us. It was clear that they wanted us to stay. With the magic of the rifles, they felt safe. Every time we asked them for rope or wood to build a bridge, they just smiled. Finally, the young chief came to us. He gave us a piece of bark. We took it back to our camp and studied it. "It's very important," I said. "He was very serious when he gave it to us." "Maybe it's a joke," Summerlee suggested. "It's clearly some kind of writing," said Challenger. "It looks like a puzzle," said Lord John. Then he grabbed the piece of bark. "I've got it," he cried. "How many marks are there?" 18. "Well, there are 18 caves above us." "He pointed to the caves when he gave it to me," I said. "Well, then it's certain. This is a map of the caves. Here's a cross. What is the cross for?" "It's next to a cave that is longer than the other ones." "It's a cave that goes to the other side of the cliff," I cried. "I believe our young friend has solved the problem," Challenger said. We got some torches and went to explore the cave. We didn't light the torches at first. We walked in the dark because we did not want the Indians to see us. After walking a long way, we lit the torches and walked quickly. Then we arrived at a wall of rock. We all became sad. "Maybe this is the wrong cave," I said. "No, young man," Lord John said. "This is the right cave." I looked at the mark on the map again, and I cried with joy. "Follow me! Follow me!" I shouted. We ran back in the cave. "Here," I said, "is where we lit the torches. But the cave has 2 arms. We didn't see the right one." We walked back a short distance and found a large black opening. We went quickly down this arm of the cave. After a while, we saw a light. We ran towards it. We were at an opening on the cliff face. "It's the moon!" cried Lord John. He was right. We looked down from the opening and saw that we were nearer to the ground than we were to the top. It wasn't going to be easy to get down, but with our rope we could do it. We then returned to our camp. The next evening we secretly took our things to the cave. Professor Challenger wanted to bring a large box, but we managed to get it down. We arrived at our old camp. There was Zambo and about 20 Indians. They helped us to get back to Para. I will not describe our voyage back to England. I will only say that the news of our great discoveries reached England before our arrival. We received many telegrams asking us for information, but we decided not to tell the newspapers anything about our discoveries. First, we wanted to give a complete description of our discoveries to the members of the Zoological Institute. About 5,000 people came to the Queen's Hall to hear about our adventures. It was a wonderful evening. When we arrived in the room, the audience cheered for a long time. Then Professor Summerlee began his presentation. He talked about the new insects and plants. He told everyone about the prehistoric animals from the Jurassic period. He described the iguanodon, the pterodactyls, the Allosaurus, and the Stegosaurus. He also talked about the ape men and the Indians of the plateau. At the end of his talk, a scientist named Professor Illingworth stood up. "This is all very wonderful, certainly," he said, "but they have no real proof." The audience began to shout, and Professor Challenger stood up. "Well, sir," Professor Challenger said, "Summerlee has his collection of plants and insects. Doesn't that convince you?" "No, it doesn't. We have some photographs." "Photographs can be faked," Professor Illingworth said. "Do you want to see the creatures for yourself?" Professor Challenger asked. "Yes, of course," Professor Illingworth answered. "And you will accept that as proof?" "Certainly," answered Illingworth. At that moment, Professor Challenger made a signal. Zambo and I came up to the stage. We carried a large, heavy box which we put down. Professor Challenger took off the cover. He looked into the box and said, "Come out, you pretty thing." Then, a young pterodactyl jumped up onto the edge of the box. Everybody was shocked. Some ladies screamed. Suddenly, the pterodactyl flew up over the heads of the audience. It flew around in large circles. "Shut the windows! Shut the windows!" Professor Challenger shouted. But there was an open window, and the pterodactyl flew out. Now everybody believed us, and the crowd carried us out of the hall on their shoulders. We were heroes. But what about Gladys? Now, I really was a hero. Well, when I arrived in England, there was no telegram from her. I was very worried and went directly to her house. When I went inside, she was at the piano. "Gladys!" I cried. "Gladys!" She looked at me with surprise. She was different. "Gladys!" I cried. "What's wrong? You're my Gladys. Gladys Hungerton?" "No," she said. "I'm Gladys Potts. This is my husband." Life is certainly absurd. I said hello to a short man with red hair. "I told my husband about us," Gladys continued. "We have no secrets. Anyway, you left me for your adventure, so I don't think you really loved me very much." I turned to leave, but then I decided to ask Gladys's husband a question. "How did you win her?" I asked. "Did you go to the North Pole? Did you travel with pirates?" "That's a little personal," he replied. "Well, just one more question then," I continued. "What's your job?" "I work in an office," he replied. I left Gladys and her new husband. I felt angry, but I also laughed at the absurdity of the situation. I will now describe one more scene before I finish. Yesterday, Professor Summerlee, Professor Challenger, and I had dinner at Lord John's house. After dinner, Lord John spoke to us. "Well," he said, "there's one thing I want to tell you. Do you remember that I noticed a strange blue color around the volcanic holes? Well, I've seen volcanic holes like that only in South Africa, near the great diamond mines of Kimberley. Then he opened a little box and took out about 30 stones. Well, I found these near the hole where we saw the pterodactyls. I didn't tell you about them earlier because I wanted to be certain. Anyway, an expert looked at them. He said they have a price of at least £200,000. Of course, we will divide this money equally. Well, Challenger, what will you do with your 50,000? I think, Professor Challenger said, that I'll build a private museum. That has always been one of my dreams. And you, Summerlee? I'll stop teaching and work on all my collections, he replied. I'll use my part of the money, Lord John said, to prepare another expedition to our plateau. And you, young man, of course, will use your money to get married. Not now, I said sadly. But if you want me, I'll be happy to come with you. Lord John said nothing, but he offered me his hand.